Shout out to Asper's Gaming for supporting me on level 3 or higher on Patreon. Hey everyone, I'm Albert Boris. So, new Super Mario Bros. This is a series of Mario games which has gained a lot of notoriety for the past decade. Infamous for all of its installments playing and feeling basically the exact same, these games aren't really known for pushing the limits of the Mario series, and with Super Mario Bros. Wonder getting unveiled a month back, that couldn't be any less true. However, despite the numerous flaws with these games, they've always had a special place in my heart. Obviously, I prefer it when a Mario game makes an effort to stand out, but that's not to say that the new Super Mario games are without their own charm. One of the first Mario games I ever owned as a child was New Super Mario Bros. On the Nintendo Wii, and although it nowadays tends to get muddled together with the rest of the series, I regularly come back to this game to experience nostalgia again, and I'm always surprised by how well it holds up on its own. So I wanted to make a video about it, and I thought, what if I ranked every single world from this game? Most people would probably just rank the levels themselves, but I've always had a bigger fascination with the worlds and how they compare to each other. Not just through which levels are played, but also how they progress and if there's any cool gimmicks on the world map itself. Will I do a ranking of the levels as well? Maybe one day, but that would take longer. Since worlds are fewer, it's easier to come up with a stable ranking. So, with all that being said, let's get started! Opening up the ranking, in last place we have World 2, the Desert World. Yeah, this probably wasn't very much of a surprise. Desert themes are pretty stigmatized in the Mario series, and this is no different. Personally, I've always kind of found them underrated. If done right, they can feel really atmospheric, despite the notion that deserts are always empty. However, World 2 of New Super Mario Bros. Wii is not one of the successes. It's actually one of my least favorite worlds ever in a Mario game, and I'm saying that while also feeling super nostalgic for it. It feels like the developers went out of their way to make the desert as unpleasant as possible. The music is barren and basic, and the setting is just a yellow wasteland with the occasional pyramids. It makes the already mediocre contents of this world even less appealing. A lot of the levels are either just really generic, or they incorporate a really frustrating gimmick. We all know about the darkness in 2-3 or the slow auto-scrolling castle. Although surprisingly, my most hated level has always been 2-5, combining some of the most resilient enemies ever with quicksand everywhere. Even average levels like 2-2 are victims of the desert. 2-4 is the only level which I feel takes advantage of the setting, as the wind at least gives it more personality. Although if I'm being honest, the only level which I don't actively have a problem with is the tower, as Roy casting fireballs at you from the top is pretty creative. But yeah, World 2 is sadly the weakest of this game, and it's not even because deserts are bad or anything, it was just handled really poorly, while also having rather unremarkable levels to top it off. Next up, we have the beginner world in this game, the Grasslands. Surprisingly, it wasn't in last place, which honestly says more about World 2 than it does about this one. World 1 in New Super Mario Bros. Wii is about what you'd expect from the first world in a Mario game. You know, open plains without any noticeable difficulty, and who can forget 1-2 being the obligatory underground level. If I were to show you what a first world typically looked like in a Mario game, this would be it. Not just because of how cliché it is, but also because it's a decent first impression actually. As generic as it is so in a good way, as each level flows nicely and typically has a gimmick without being too difficult for newcomers. Some of them introduce the propeller suit, Yoshi, or rolling hills, although some more ambitious examples might include a tower with its crushing platforms or the castle with cogwheels. Surprisingly, my favorite level was actually 1-4, an underwater level, yeah. I've always been sold by the somber music and detailed marine life, but the fact that you can actually jump out of the water and also run on solid ground just makes it much more unique. Aside from that one example, I wouldn't really say the levels are that ambitious. I mean, 1-5 is just your typical athletic level, but for what World 1 has overall, it's a decent opening to the game. So, as expected, the weakest worlds were the first two. Nothing unusual. Naturally, they'd be more simple than what we'd get later in the game, since the developers have to restrict themselves from going too creative, or it might get too difficult. And because that's typically the case, I always ask myself, why is World 6 so underwhelming? When you first arrive to it, it looks pretty cool on the outside. The vertical layout makes you think you're gonna ascend a dangerous mountain, and the map music is epic. Alone, it gives this world a boost on my ranking, but then I play the levels themselves, and I could not be more underwhelmed. It's disappointing how the mountain levels use the basic Overworld theme instead of a unique song, but that's the least of the problems. The only level that really incorporates the mountain setting would be 6-1 and 4, and even then, none of the levels are vertical, despite the map practically camping on that. Yeesh, talk about clickbait. I mean, okay, the tower is vertical as it's always been, and it's a nerve-wracking one, but come on Nintendo. It's not a major issue, the levels are still good. Actually, about that. On one hand, half the levels are really solid, although it's ironic that the best level has nothing to do with World 6's mountain theme. But the other half I could really care less for, and 6-2, 5 and 6 downright aggravate me. Even the airship level was lesser than usual since you were stuck in an auto-scroller, although its boss was at least one of my favorites. One thing is for sure, World 6's strength lies in the map design, and while some of the levels are really good, a lot of them are also kind of forgettable, and the theming could have been handled much better. It's more interesting than World 1 on average, but it's about that. Luckily, from this point on, we're moving on to the worlds which I will largely have more positive than negative things to say about. In 6th place, we have World 9, the special world of this game, which kinda serves as an epilogue to the game after you beat the main story. Although exactly how special it is a bit of a different story. Unlike the other worlds in this game, this one has a completely different structure, with no bosses, castle, ghost houses, or any of that. Instead, you got 8 different levels, but you can't play them right away. You need to collect the star coins in each world to unlock one level at a time, and they're each based on one of the 8 world themes in this game. Actually, there's no space level, in spite of the world theme resembling Rainbow Road. If Nintendo is gonna keep up the clickbaiting, I might as well follow. Okay, it's kinda understandable why there's no space level. As long as the levels themselves are special enough to be part of the post-game content, and while I'd say it does a pretty good job at that, the only truly special level is 9-7. It's possibly the game's most iconic stage, infamous for its infuriating difficulty, and it helps that the setting is a snowy jungle unlike anything else. That's not to say it's the only unique one, but none of the other levels really go to the same extent of standing out, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, as long as they're still good. 9-3 introduces us to bullseye bills, 9-4 is an auto-scroller based around arrow lifts, 9-5 is a vertical platformer set during a snowstorm, and 9-8 gives debut to the king bills. Then of course you also have absolute jokes like 9-1, which I could not differentiate from any other athletic level, as well as 9-6. Out of all Volcano levels in the game, they went with the absolute most forgettable one to represent World 9. I guess the Skelecoaster was too boring. A bonus world should only have the very best, but at least the good levels overshadow the mediocre ones. That said, I can't personally see myself putting it above some of the other worlds in the game, as it's not the most coherent world. Since the theming is all over the place for these levels, the progression is certainly different. With no dungeons or bosses, it doesn't feel as much like a journey, but for what it's worth, World 9 is pretty good, and it's a decent conclusion to the game. In 5th place, we have the Winter Wonderland World 3. This is a nostalgic one for me. Growing up, it was probably the part of the game which took me the longest to complete, partly because a young me found it too difficult, but also because of a very unique gimmick on the world map which I didn't fully grasp at first. On the whole, I'd say it's actually surprisingly ambitious for being a third world, with lots of things to worry about, only amplified by the ice physics. Perhaps one of the most notable aspects of World 3 is the debut of the penguin suit power-up, which allows you to throw ice balls, slide on the ground, and swim much more efficiently. There hasn't been a power-up with so many uses since, and it adds a whole new layer to the gameplay. In World 3 particularly, whether you're showing Cooligans who's boss, freezing bullet bills to reach bigger heights, swimming through underground currents, it's amazing. In fact, I'd say that while World 3 isn't the best one in the game, it's by far the most consistent one, with each and every single level being fun in its own right. Well, except for the introduction of the dreaded ghost house levels. I don't know what it is, but I've always despised this aspect of the new Super Mario games. They're basically normal platformer levels, except with trolls everywhere, and it doesn't even feel scary, just taunting. But beyond that, it's a very decent selection. 3-4 in particular has always stuck with me. At first, it's a pretty average snow level, then you realize that was actually the secret exit. If you want to find the main exit, you first gotta reach this red switch on the world map, which will spawn new platforms in a level, allowing you to find a hidden warp and progress to the castle. I wish more levels did something like this. The Rock Candy Mines world in New Super Mario Bros. U kinda did something like this, but it didn't really affect the levels themselves, just the world map. In the end, World 3 of this game reigns superior for sure. World 5, the Jungle World, is in 4th place for me. Now this is quite a unique one. The forest setting has always been one of my favorites in Mario games, as someone who regularly goes out to the woods during free time. They're already a very pretty environment, but most importantly, Forest equals wildlife, and in the context of Mario, that typically means a lot of unique enemies such as the Brambles, Wigglers, Riverside Tuis, or Jumbo Rays. It just makes the levels pop out more, feel more alive, and it only helps if the jungle itself is absolutely stunning, with trees barely letting sunlight pass through. So the jungle setting on its own is enough to appeal to me, and luckily all of the jungle themed levels are very unique with neat gimmicks, especially the one where you're trying to keep enemies off your raft. Even the world map is kinda nifty, as brambles will grow over certain pathways, forcing you to go a certain way. That said, beyond the stage with Jumbo Rays, the levels that don't take place in a forest fall a bit on the flat side. For one, there is the worst level in the entire game. Ghost House and Darkness and Underwater?
Wow!
Because we sure couldn't have lived without such a pleasant combo, am I right? The others aren't bad at all, they're just not very memorable, and the castle's fireball gimmick was better suited for World 2's tower anyways. But besides that one level, World 5 is very consistent, as much as it's primarily lifted by its setting. Now this is an underrated world. Opening up the top 3 is the gem known as World 4. As I mentioned earlier in this video, World 3 was the one that took the longest for me to beat, to the point that it actually kind of irritated me. It felt so good to finally be over with it, and it could not be more ironic that the reward was literally a trip to Toff the Beach. Most people don't really like water worlds, because it usually means you're gonna have to do a lot of swimming, but surprisingly, this world only has one underwater level, and while it's admittedly pretty generic, I could personally care less. The majority of stages take place on beaches, and just like with the jungle world, it's absolutely stunning, and the developers really took advantage of the theming. 4-1 as an example has the alternating between above and underwater, and the penguin suit only makes swimming that much more swift. 4-5 is where it's really at though personally, with the palm trees, coin rain, and Yoshi. Just like with World 5, the positives are largely based on the theming itself, and the levels that aren't beach themed are yet again a bit less memorable sadly. That said, the average quality of them is a bit better in my opinion, hence why it's ranked higher. The ghost house isn't as infuriating, the castle is more unique, and it's our first taste of the airship levels. You can't really go wrong with them. I've always had a special place in my heart for this world, and it hasn't aged badly one bit. It's just that the final 2 worlds are somehow even better in this game. In second place, we have World 7, the Sky. This was a bit of a shock for me. Unlike the forest and beach themes, this is not a theme I'm particularly fond of in Mario games. How would you describe Sky Worlds? Well, I'd say it has clouds, and you're pretty high up in the air. Do you know what else shares these traits? Regular athletic levels. Yeah, that's the problem. They're often the penultimate worlds, but typically contain generic athletic levels resembling World 1, except harder. Originality is pretty scarce, and to a start, that appears to be the case for this cloudy world as well, as 7-1 could not be any more basic. But then it takes a surprising turn, and what do you know, World 7 is actually quite original. Because right after, you get levels where you're swimming through bubbles, navigating through thick fog, jumping on parabeetles, or using the Wiimote to send these platforms haywire. Even the setting itself changes noticeably between levels. Sometimes there's a lot of clouds, sometimes it feels like you're in the stratosphere. And although the ghost house isn't really sky themed, even that was surprisingly fun since the bruisers are engaging and you actually get to explore the outside as well. The tower and castle levels though, my goodness, if only every new Super Mario Bros. Game was as original as this. Unlike other types of these levels, they actually use the sky theme as part of their level, and it couldn't be more chilling. The tower level actually makes you feel like you're infiltrating an enemy hideout with all of the bullet bills you have to avoid. Meanwhile, the castle is half destroyed, exposing the sky in the background, making for a completely different atmosphere, and I absolutely love it. Why couldn't other castle levels do something like this? It's insane. Really, there's basically nothing to complain about in World 7. It's absolutely kingly. By this point, it's pretty obvious what number 1 is, so let's just get right to what I believe to be New Super Mario Bros. Wii's best world. World 8. This is nothing short of pure kingly. This is an amazing example of how to make a final world. Or well, okay, that's technically World 9, but in the context of the main story, World 8 could not be a more epic finale. Predictably, it's a volcanic world, which is obviously pretty fitting for the final challenge. Right from the get-go, the first level has you avoiding a meteor shower while a toxic fog is slowly approaching you from the left. And that's just the first level. The rest of the world isn't any worse. In fact, half of this world's stages are S tier for me. Okay, 8-4 is admittedly pretty annoying, combining both underwater and darkness, but at least it's pretty creative compared to other water stages. And just as unique are the underground stages, because instead of being the typical blue caverns we saw in earlier worlds, this time it actually takes place under a volcano, with even a new remix. And it only gets better from there on. You got a level where you're avoiding falling bob-bombs while on a Wiimote controlled platform, another one where you're riding on a skelecoaster, as well as the best airship level in the game, with a more ominous sky and edgier boss battle. One level of it always stuck with me particularly though would be 8-6, where you're climbing up a volcano with rising lava. These kinds of levels have always frightened me as someone who played Mario Forever a lot growing up. That fan game had a similar level, which was much more nerve-wracking, so the shock has always kinda lived on for me when I play similar stages. Surprisingly, the tower and castle levels are the most generic ones of the bunch, but there's a fun irony to it. Up until this point, all of the boss dungeons in the game had their own unique gimmicks, so the fact that the final ones are just average lava dungeons like in the original Mario Bros is actually kind of clever. And they're both concluded by a difficult fight with Kamek, and in the castle situation, the best Bowser fight in any Mario game. It's kinda self-explanatory, the music is perfect and the build-up is absolutely epic. There's no way World 8 wouldn't take the top spot on my ranking, and that, my friends, was my ranking of the worlds in New Super Mario Bros. Wii. But what is your ranking? Did you agree with me or not? If you enjoyed this video, then make sure to like, share and subscribe to my channel as I talk about everything Mario related. Follow me on Discord, Twitter and Patreon, and with all that being said, I'm signing off. Until next time.